Welcome to the Public Banking Town Hall for Colorado Leaders. It's being hosted today by the Colorado Public Banking Coalition and Public Banking Institute. I'm Micah Parkin, and I'm with 350 Colorado, and we're one of the members of the Colorado Public Banking Coalition, along with a number of other groups, and we will be hearing from some of them today. So thank you so much for joining us, and this is being recorded just so people know. And if you have questions that pop up during this event, please feel free to use the chat box. You can just hover your cursor over the screen and the chat box will show up at the bottom, and you can click on that and type questions over on the side. And also, we did not mute people for this event. We want you to feel free to keep yourself muted until you have a question, and then feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions as at the end, we have a 10-minute section for question and answers. So just to quickly review our agenda, we have author and public banking expert Ellen Brown with us today from the Public Banking Institute. Thank you so much for being with us, Ellen. And then we'll also have Earl Stlin from the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute and also a member of Colorado Public Banking Coalition to speak for a few minutes. And then we'll have our Q&A. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. So Colorado Public Banking Coalition, if you're not familiar with our organization, this coalition is, we're focused on creating local public banks that are socially and environmentally responsible, that keep our money working for our communities. And we have a sign-on letter that has been signed by numerous organizations and leaders around Colorado. And we invite anyone watching this to please feel free to go to our website, coloradopublicbankingcoalition.org, and sign the support letter, join the email list, and get involved and learn more. Well, next, we have author Ellen Brown. She's chair of the Public Banking Institute, author of Public Banking Solution, and a number of other books. Ellen, we're so pleased to have you here today, and thank you so much for speaking as part of this Public Banking Town Hall. Please take it away.
Rush through this PowerPoint. Can you put the PowerPoint up? Micah, can you put the PowerPoint up?
Yes. Sorry about that. Here we go.
Okay, I'm going to really have to rush because I only have 10 minutes. Next, can you flip it? Thanks on the blunder. So we have a serious problem right now, as you all know, I'm sure. States are short of money, revenues are reduced, and costs are up, and states are required to balance their books. They can't go $1 trillion in debt every year like the federal government can. Next. And CARES Act has not been much help. It only included $150 billion out of $3 trillion, so that's only 5% actually went to the states. And there are such strictures around what you can use the money for that much of it is not usable. I heard the governor of New Jersey saying he might have to give some of that, little amount of money, might have to give some of it back because it can only be used for things directly relevant to this crisis. It can't be used for anything in the budget before March, which means practically everything. But I would argue that maybe some of the money could be used to capitalize a bank, since that is part of the crisis. We need funding right now, and that's a way to do it. The other option at the federal level is that the Federal Reserve has set up this municipal liquidity facility where you can sell your bonds, but the problem is that it's at the market rate plus a penalty. So that's not going to help much either. I don't know. I think Colorado's rating is probably pretty good. So that's not of much use. Next. Meanwhile, the banks have gotten a free ride here. The Federal Reserve totally bailed them out under cover of this virus. So now they are invited to go to the discount window. Any bank in good standing can go to the discount window and borrow at 0 to 0.25%, like virtually for free. It used to be banks didn't go to the discount window because there was a penalty attached, and they only went there if they were desperate, and then the other banks knew they were desperate and they wouldn't lend to them, etc. But now the Federal Reserve is saying, come one, come all, no reserve requirement. You don't have to worry about even holding back some of your deposits. They're being very lenient on the capital requirements, and you can use this money for anything you want. You know, no strings attached like there are for the federal money for the states. So a very good deal for them. And I believe the rates are going to stay down there a long, long time. And here's why. I don't think they really did it because of the virus. I think they did it because they've been bailing out the repo market ever since September, and they were putting up $1 trillion a day for the repo market. That's where banks borrow now, because they don't lend to each other, because they've been afraid to lend to each other ever since 2008, because they didn't know who had the bad assets. So I'll bet it's going to be very, very low for a very long time, maybe forever. Who knows? Next. So the obvious solution, we the people should form our own banks, our own publicly owned banks. Next. What is a public bank? I think you know it's a state-owned bank, city-owned bank, etc., with a mission to serve the public interest. Next. This is sort of a foreign idea here, but globally, 25% of banking assets are publicly owned. And in the 1970s, it was 50%. And then we went through this period of privatization, liberalization, etc. Next. The biggest, actually, I should say, is China, which 80% of banking assets in China are publicly owned. And so the state government just goes to their big banks, borrows money into existence, which is how banking works, and funds whatever they need, high-speed rail, etc. And then the proceeds of whatever they built pays back the loan. And Roosevelt did the same thing in the 1930s. Very good model. That's what credit should be all about. Our nearest model of a Western variety is in Germany, where the Sparkassen banks, publicly owned banks, have 40% of total banking assets. Every little town has its Sparkassen bank. They're not allowed to go outside their community for lending, and they particularly focused on small and medium-sized businesses. And it's a very, very good model, and it's said to be responsible for their why they're so good in marketing things. Their KfW bank is their big development bank, public development bank. It's currently making 1% business loans, and the process is very easy. And apparently they seem to have unlimited funds. And you can compare that to our SBA program right now, where the loans are 3.75%, and the procedure is quite complicated. And the big companies already snatched up most of the money. Next. In the US, we only have one state-owned bank, but it's a stellar model. I started writing about it after 2008 because I knew they were the only state that had their own bank, so I was watching it. It turned out it was the only bank that never went in the red. It had the lowest unemployment rate in the country, the lowest default rate, the lowest foreclosure rate, and they have the most local banks per capita. I think they have 6 banks, and 6 times as many banks as other banks on average. Next. And it's, sorry, in 2014, the Wall Street Journal came out with an article that said that the Bank of North Dakota is actually more profitable than Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase, with a return on equity of 18.56%, which is amazing. So how do they do it? They're not trying to be profitable. They're trying to serve the local community. Next. Their secret is their business model. They cut out all the middlemen, and so they don't have private shareholders. They don't have pay bonuses, fees, or commissions. They don't have any high-paid CEOs. They don't have to advertise. By law, all of the state's revenues are deposited in the bank. Now, you wouldn't have to do that. You could put whatever portion you want to in, but that's the way their system is set up. And they don't have to advertise for customers. They actually partner with the local banks. In fact, that's in their charter. They're not allowed to compete with the local banks. So the local bank is kind of like the front office that finds a customer. And then if they have a loan that's too big for them to handle, they'll go to the Bank of North Dakota, which serves as sort of a banker's bank to help with liquidity, help with capitalization, help with regulations, etc. Next. Across the whole country, we currently have a pretty vibrant movement going. We've been working on this for the last 10 years. So there are over 25 bills being actively pursued in different states, as you can see here, and there are over 50 groups that are pursuing this idea. Next. Legislators sometimes ask, why do we need publicly owned banks? We've already got lots of banks, and we've already got loan funds that are making the same kind of loans that you're talking about. But the difference is, first of all, on the loan funds, the difference is leverage. If you, for example, we've got the California Infrastructure and Development Bank in California, which is called a bank, but it's not really a bank. So they've got a loan fund of $300 million. They've got 20 times as much demand for these loans as they actually have money to lend. If you took that 300 million, which is their money, if you called that capital, you could then lend 3 billion. You could make 10 times as many loans, which means if you're lending, even let's say you're making very low rate loans at 2%, you could be making 20% on that, less your cost, but I'll get into that in a minute. And the other advantage over a public loan fund is that if the loan fund had to borrow, like issue bonds in order to get the liquidity to lend, they would be lending at borrowing at bond rates, and if they're a bank, they can borrow basically for free. Next. And then the advantages over private banks. Next. For one thing, private banks are very expensive. They charge high fees. I mean, I think you know all that, so I'll skip next. Half the cost of infrastructure is financing, and this is just now taken kind of as a rule of thumb. Well, let's say that if you can borrow for free, then you're essentially cutting out all your financing costs except your non-interest operating costs. And if you can get them down to the Bank of North Dakota's, which might be difficult, but their non-interest operating costs are 14% of their profits. So let's say you're even making very low loans at 2%. Times 10, that's 20%, and then you cut out 14% of that, you're still making about 18%, which is what the Bank of North Dakota does, which is amazing. I mean, I think that's optimistic, because I don't know how they get their operating costs down that low. But anyway, that's the possibility, that's the potential. Next. Studies have shown that public banks make more loans during crises, whereas private banks make less. So they operate countercyclically. So they step in when the private banks are failing. So they're particularly important in crises like right now. Next. We have various examples of how well they've done in crises. They do things like moratorium on foreclosures, which is what the Bank of North Dakota did when they had a big flood in Grand Falls in 1997, and they made very cheap loans, and they were in there right away helping with their financing. You didn't have to wait around for FEMA. And the city happened to be divided, half in North Dakota and half in Minnesota. And the North Dakota half recovered very quickly, and the Minnesota half was devastated for years because they just didn't have the kind of help that North Dakota had. And then there's example of KFW, which I already mentioned. Next. And the Bank of North Dakota in this current crisis has done remarkably well. They're #1 in making payroll protection program loans. They're working with the local banks, but they coordinate the whole thing. They've made 10 times as many, or made the loans 10 times faster than in the slowest state, which I think was Texas. And I guess that's all. Next. So why do we need public banks? First of all, you can borrow for very cheaply, which allows you, or like almost nothing, which allows you to lend at 1 to 2%, make quite low interest loans. You can direct credit where the community needs it most, and restore your tax base. And as you get money out into the community, you're going to get more taxes, you're going to stimulate the economy. So it's a self-perpetuating, whatever, momentum. So I guess that's all I have to say. Next. That's So we think you can do this very quickly. You could use your emergency executive powers to set up a bank. It's just a matter of political will and understanding why you really want to do it. Next. So that's all I've got. If you want more information, our website is publicbankinginstitute.org, and my own website where I've got lots of articles on this is ellenbrown.com. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ellen Brown. That was excellent presentation. We really appreciate you being on and sharing your broad knowledge about this topic with all of us. So next up, we have Earl Stlin. Earl is the chair of the Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute. He's an attorney here in Colorado. He's also one of the founding members of the Colorado Public Banking Coalition. And he's going to talk to us about how a public bank could be established here in Colorado and how it could benefit us, especially during this COVID crisis. Thank you so much, Earl. And Earl, you may need to unmute yourself. We can't hear you yet.
Okay.
There you go.
Thanks, Micah, and thanks, Ellen. You're a hard act to follow.
No.
This first slide is an illustration of the private banking model. The goal of a private bank is to maximize profit. And the way to do that most efficiently and effectively is to invest in things that are not sustainable. So you see the list at the right, and we put a tree as the source of the money for a good reason. Go back to the private model.
Sorry about that.
And that's because a bank is actually creating new money that did not exist before when they make a loan. And you see armaments and war, fossil fuels, private prisons, big pharma, 3 P projects which are actually privatization, like the Boulder Denver Highway, some types of derivatives and speculation. Asset bubbles, of course, are promoted by the private banks, and other forms of privatization, wanting to sell off Social Security, wanting to sell off the post office, for example. So let's look at the next slide. And here are the things that a public bank can lend in. Down there you see infrastructure, where, as Ellen pointed out, you cut the cost virtually in half. Affordable housing is even more costly in terms of financing. It's about 77% of public housing costs are interest. So you basically can build public housing for 23% of the cost if you avoid the interest. Healthcare, clean energy, student loans, sustainable development and agriculture, community broadcast, which is still a crying need in parts of Colorado. And we can fund independent media or fund existing corporate media, but make them more responsible, because they find it harder now to fund investigative reporters and so forth. Okay, next slide. Ellen already talked about the Sparkassen, or the German funding, but one point is that renewables in the center there, that's now up to 46% of its electricity now being generated as of last year, thanks to the enormous amount of money they've put into clean energy. Okay, next. Many people have raised the question of whether public banks are legal in Colorado, and Jonathan Singer sent a memorandum and requested a legal opinion from the Colorado's Office of Legislative Legal Services, the legal arm of the legislature. And they, in October, issued a legal opinion saying that a state public bank, if it's a self-sustaining Tabor enterprise, is probably legal under Colorado Constitution, Article 11, Sections 1 and 3. I won't go into that. And you can find on our websites links to that. Also, the Public Banking Institute website has a link to the legal services memo that shows why that's legal. And it's it's a strong burden to overcome that. There's a strong presumption, a heavy presumption in its favor, and the opponent has to prove that it's not constitutional beyond a reasonable doubt. And of course, the Tabor enterprise is exempt from the Tabor limits on revenue and expenditures, which has made it very difficult for governments to meet some of their basic infrastructure, housing, and other essential needs. Next. An example are the Denver bonds of 2017. 937 million in bonds. The total obligation is 1.7 billion when they're paid off in full, and you can do the calculation, but that means the interest is 763 million, or 45% of the total cost. As Ellen said, close to 50% of these big projects. All that can be saved. And for housing costs, as I mentioned, and there's also a link on our websites demonstrating that 77% of the cost of public housing projects are interest. And that's a crying need that got much, much worse after 2008. Next slide. Another source of funding, the comprehensive annual financial report of every political unit in the country is required to be published. And for Colorado, we call those CAFRs, by the way. It shows, and you can see the page number cited here, but some $6.6 billion in total funds. Some of that could probably be used for capital and also for deposits in a public bank. Next slide. We did a preliminary estimate of what might be done with that. I'm sorry this slide didn't come through clearly as it was meant to, but you can see in green up there the line across lists for year one net loan portfolio $6.75 billion, and that would be a big increase in lending. But we did this, we prepared this long before the COVID crisis, and we actually need a lot more money than that to overcome this $3 billion deficit. If you look down below, you see for equity, total equity 550 billion. That's like your capital. We could actually generate much more capital than that. And let's go to the next slide. Based even on that rather small or conservative estimate, you'll see a significant profit for the bank in the very first year. And that's, as Ellen pointed out, it's because they operate with very low overhead, do not take speculative risks, and they work in cooperation or partnership with the local banks. And so as a team, you have a much more efficient, low cost, and safe banking mechanism to fund your economy. And the return on equity was 25%. That was actually based on probably too low an estimate for the cost of the bank. Operations, I redid that for the same relative cost as the Bank of North Dakota. It came out still to 21% in the first year. Next slide. Where will we get the funds to start a public bank? And we have public officials very concerned about that. They look in the budget and they say it's not there. Well, they're right, but that's not where you look to find those funds. But there are a number of sources. Number one, we can transfer the deposits that are now in the major banks to the state public bank, or that could be done at the city or county level as well. Another source is revenue bonds. The money to pay revenue bonds comes solely from the bank's income, so it does not obligate either the bank or the government that sponsors the bank. Number 3, transfer existing state loan funds. The Colorado Housing Finance Authority, for example, has substantial funds that are loaned for public housing, but we can save 77% of the cost that consists of interest by having a bank do that. Same thing with the Colorado Water lending, and there are a number of other lending agencies in Colorado that could do 10 times as much lending if those funds were converted into a bank. Investment pools is another source of funds. I think the legislature might have to authorize that, but there's every justification to do that. Another source would be pension funds. If, for example, the state were to authorize, or the PARA were to authorize using up to 10% of its funds, which are, as of 2018, $49.3 billion, that could provide capital of 4.9, almost $5 billion to create $49 billion in loans. When you figure taxes on that, on the income from all that, that would be more than $3 billion, which is the current budget deficit. We might need that kind of a robust bank to overcome the deficit, but it could be done. And finally, CARES Act fund appear to open the door to having some of that used for capital for a bank, because they specifically authorize grants to small businesses for lost business due to the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, if they can give grants, a loan, if it's in the form of a bank, could do 10 times as much funding. So that's another possible avenue, or any combination of the above. So there's no reason to think that we can't do this. Next slide. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Earl. Excellent presentation, very informative. So now we're opening it up to question and answers with today's speakers. So if anybody has a question that you would like to ask, you can either come off mute and do so verbally, or feel free, if you'd prefer, to just type your question in the chat box. Again, you can just hover your cursor over the screen and the chat box should pop up as an option at the bottom. You click on that and type in over on the right-hand side. So I'm gonna stop the screen sharing now so that people can more easily see the speakers. But I wanted to just one more time, if people want to sign up in support, whether you're an elected official, a business owner, an individual, you're welcome to go to the website coloradopublicbankingcoalition.org and sign the support letter to show your support. You can sign up on the email list to stay informed about this topic and get more involved, and we would love to have you. So thank you so much, Ellen and Earl. Do we have any questions? And I think Deb has been monitoring the questions over in the chat box. Deb, do we have any yet?
There are no questions in the chat. I just want to invite participants to unmute themselves if they have a question, and we can start that way. So one question just came in to me through the chat. So there are a number of people here from representing county level governments. We have people from Pitkin, Adams, Netherland, Eagle, Aurora, and Ridgeway on the call today. And one participant is wondering, what is the best place to start at the county level?
I'll make a comment about that. I didn't mention it, but it's in our slide that the Office of Legislative Legal Services followed their legal opinion with a second memo that said that home rule counties and cities probably already have the right to create a publicly owned bank. And there are actually only two home rule counties in Colorado, Pitkin, which is Aspen, Colorado, and also Weld County. But counties can become home rule counties. It's not that difficult. They have to submit it to a charter vote to amend their charter. So that can be done. But there's also another possibility that a state-owned bank could authorize cities and counties in creating a state-owned bank to become part of that and become a partner in that bank. And some of the legislation in other states have done something like that. North Dakota's model, of course, has private banks rather than counties. But Washington State's model, which is still pending, really does incorporate the participation of local communities if they want to do that. So that can be done.
Maybe, Earl, would you speak a little bit more about the legislation that Representative Jonathan Singer has that we've worked with him to draft, and he has a draft ready to present this legislative session if it was allowed. We know that the legislative session has been greatly narrowed in its focus because of the current crises that we're facing. But would you talk about that legislation and what it would enable around that topic of allowing counties and other local governments and state government, please?
Yes, it's initially roughly similar to the California legislation that authorized cities and counties to have their own public banks. And once that authorization is given, it will enable counties, even if they're not home rule, to have a public bank. And we think that that's very important because there are so few counties that are home rule, and they need this funding just as badly. They've had huge problems with education, hospital shortages, medical care, infrastructure, you name it. So it would be invaluable to get them aboard with legislation like that. I think that covers it. Also, the proposed legislation includes, and we eventually separated it into a separate piece of legislation, authorizing a state-owned bank. And as I said, another way to do it is like Washington does, where you incorporate the state and local governments in the same bill.
Mm-hmm. And there's also the possibility, and maybe Ellen, you could speak to this a little bit, for Governor Polis, our Colorado governor, to actually do an executive action around this. Would you speak to that a little bit? Oh, you're muted, Ellen.
Yeah.
There you go.
I heard Earl speaking about that earlier at our 9 o'clock Zoom, so maybe Earl should take it away.
Okay.
All right. Well, a governor for emergencies, and we're certainly in both a health and a financial emergency, can issue executive orders by law. And I mentioned, when I mentioned the legal piece, that there is a heavy presumption in favor of legislation, and the opponent, person who challenges its constitutionality, must show that it's unconstitutional beyond a reasonable doubt. The same standard that prevails in criminal cases. And the same standard applies to executive orders. So the governor, and here we are very near the end of the legislative session when they haven't had any time to consider really critical issues like this, doesn't really have time in this session to debate something this weighty. But the governor does have the authority to do this. And it was actually his fellow governor, who is chair of the governor's conference, Phil Murphy in New Jersey, who ran on a public banking platform and issued an executive order last November for New Jersey to implement a board for a state-owned bank, and within a year. And you know, that's now 6 months, 7 months underway, and they've been working towards it. But that was before COVID. They could accelerate that, and Governor Polis could do the same thing here and basically take our legislation and turn that into an executive order. We could have a bank within a month or a few months. It's not that hard. North Dakota did it 100 years ago with no blueprint, from scratch, and they had it in operation within a few months after they got started.
Yeah, and particularly if you buy a bank, then you would already have FDIC insurance. You would already, assuming that's required, you would already have a master account with the Fed. So that, otherwise, it took the Bank of America Samoa 2 years to get a master account with the Fed. So that's a hurdle you're going to jump over as fast as you can.
Yeah. Well, Colorado's statute on banks only requires that the bank at the time of its application have applied for either the Fed or the FDIC. And they don't require you to already have it. So it's not that stringent. I think there's some legal grounds for saying that even FDIC membership is not necessary. And of course, if a bank only has one depositor, like the state of Colorado, FDIC membership is pointless because it only covers $250,000, which is less than 1% of the way less than 1% of the deposits of, say, 100 million or several billion. So
I'm wondering, could I possibly jump in with a question?
Yes, please, feel free.
Thank you. This is Kelly McNicholas Curry. I'm a county commissioner in Pitkin County, and this has been incredibly interesting and informative and helpful. And I'm just wondering, in the preliminary discussions we've had just about kind of setting up an emergency loan process, some of the criticism has been competition with private banks. And I just wonder if you have any suggestions on getting around that critique.
Yeah, well, the Bank of North Dakota is required not to. They're not allowed to compete with private banks. And in California, we just passed AB 857, which set out the requirements for a state-owned or a city-owned or municipally owned bank. And it too says that the bank can't compete with the local banks. So you can compete with a Wall Street bank, that's different. But the local banks you want to partner with. And so they're like a banker's bank for the local banks.
Great question.
Okay, thank you.
Much. We have another question in the chat. So Susan Smirnoff asks, what are the risks of an executive order if the next governor has no interest in public banking?
Let Earl do that.
well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it would be a horrible mistake. However, if the executive order does what it can do and is done correctly, it's going to bring us out of the recession to the point where you wouldn't have to have the bank to keep it going. Actually, North Dakota kind of wavered between conservative administrations and more progressive ones, and the bank still survived when the, for example, more conservative administrations were in charge. It just didn't do as much to solve problems, but it continued to be profitable. I don't think it would necessarily, in fact, when the Republicans, it was the nonpartisan league that got the bank started in North Dakota. And when their opponents got into power, they initially wanted to shut it down, but they realized it was a very good thing for the state, and they didn't shut it down. And I'm sure everyone is glad they didn't, because North Dakota is a very red state. There are private banks, probably most of them are Republicans. They love their bank. It makes them strong. It protects them from the big Wall Street banks. It has enabled that state to be the only state to avoid the Great Recession in 2008. And it wasn't just the Bank of North Dakota, it was because all their loans were in partnership with the local banks. So all the local bank lending also kept going, and they did not have a recession. That slide that Ellen showed of public banks versus private banks and their behavior in a recession being just the opposite. The public banks all just increase lending a little bit and you have no recession. The private banks are only thinking of their shareholders, so they cut lending. And that triggers a recession, if not a great recession. So my answer would be, I think any subsequent governor would realize that this would be crazy to destroy the bank. And if they did, we're still going to be out of the recession by then. So it's not going to destroy us.
Thank you.
Yes, Kimbria pointed out in the chat, if a public bank was doing everything right, bringing money into the state's coffers and supporting our communities, why would someone want to stop a successful run? And I think that's a very good point. We've seen lots of success stories with public banks. So sorry, Sophie, go ahead.
I was just going to ask the next question. So it's how do we define compete, i.e. not competing with local banks, but can compete with national or multinational banks?
Yes, well, a local bank would be, in California, for example, the big bank that the city of LA has its money with now is Wells Fargo, which was actually at one time a California bank. It was actually incorporated in California, but it's now in, I forget, South Dakota or somewhere. You know, that's where their principal offices are. So it's actually an out-of-state bank. So those are the ones we do want to compete with. Whereas your local banks would be, they could be credit unions. You know, it's the ones that are founded in California, not or in your state, not huge, you know, not too big to fail type banks. And what we mean is they would be making the loans. They'll be out there dealing with the actual customers. We don't want to steal their customers. We want to help them with their customers.
Mm-hmm.
And,
I just want to note quickly. Go ahead. Sorry.
Can I come in, Alec?
Yes.
So this issue, I think both Earl and myself, in putting together the question and answers, sort of looked at, and that is to say, they wouldn't compete with the local banks, but they would compete with the big banks, but not unfairly. Not the issue is that it's not unfair competition, so that you know, competition is as American as apple pie. So nothing wrong with that. It's the unfairness of it that that might be wrong. And with respect to the local banks, we would collaborate with them. It would be good for both the public bank and the local banks, it seems to me.
Yes, I would add to that you know, the big Wall Street banks really want to invest in very different kinds of things, as I pointed out in that slide, comparing the public banks and the private banks. They want to invest in unsustainable things that maximize profit, but also maximize risk. Whereas the public bank wants to invest in things that are sustainable, support the local community. So in that sense, they're not competing either.
Yes.
Yeah, our argument is that we're actually filling a market that's not being serviced right now.
Yes, very good point. That's the way to do it, yes.
I want to just point out we're at the 45-minute mark, which we had put on the invitation, and so the Zoom invitation. And if people need to drop off, we completely understand. But there are some good questions and thoughts coming up. So Ellen, are you able to stay on just maybe 5 more minutes to answer another question or two?
Yeah, sure, I can say.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see. There was a question about does anyone know what the governor or staff thinks about public banking? We definitely don't want to guess what they're thinking, and I'm not sure if anybody does know for sure. And if we don't want to guess on that. Has anyone specifically spoken with the governor? I don't believe so lately on this. Any answer to that, or are we unsure?
I can comment that heard it reported that during his campaign for governor, he was at various appearances where Bernard Douthit and sometimes Dave Young spoke in favor of a public bank. And he expressed interest and said, I'd like to see a business plan. And we've kind of done preliminary business plans. And I think that's a very good point. Washington State has prepared a business plan that is now being looked at by their Senate. We can do that. And I think he's
New Mexico just came out with one too.
Can't we copy those business plans and just say, here, it's already the $500,000 was paid for already. Why duplicate it except for changing a few things? What
Yeah, that's what we've been telling them, the cities in LA, just wait for, or in California, wait for the big one to come through and then copy, because they're expensive.
Well, we don't. Not everybody has to. Not every state has to spend the same amount of money when the model is out there, and we just put in different figures that apply to the particular state or the particular city.
Well, there are two different things here. One is a feasibility study.
Oh, I understand.
And that's not needed at all. I mean, the Bank of North Dakota proves the concept is not only successful, it's much more successful than the Wall Street banks. A business plan includes who's your staff, where's the funding coming from, what are your expenses to run the office. It gives all the details, and because public banks are very low overhead, it's going to be quite different from a private bank's business plan. It's going to be much more streamlined, and it's going to show a profit the first year, which is very different from the usual private bank.
So we have another question. It's, can a private citizen walk into a municipal bank and open an account?
No.
Probably not. In North Dakota, 2% of their accounts or of their deposits are individually owned. So they just do that because they thought, well, we're a public bank, we should be open to the public. But they don't make it easy at all. You have to live right there. They don't have branches. They have 2 branches now. They haven't stuck a one. But
and in Colorado, we don't need to do it.
no, and we'd recommend against it, because what we're recommending is postal banks. We hope to be able to get postal banking going again for the unbanked and underbanked. And other than that, you would go to your local community bank and do your banking, and then the Bank of North Dakota, or sorry, your state bank would come in and help to the extent that, that they're invited in.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And same situation if a local community public bank was created as well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great.
That would be our recommendation, but you can do what you want. It hasn't been done yet.
Exactly. Well, I know we've gone over, and so I don't want to keep everyone too long, but we're so grateful, Ellen Brown, again, for joining us today, and for Public Banking Institute, all of your support. And to Earl Stlin also for speaking today in Rocky Mountain Public Banking Institute. And our coalition again wants to encourage everyone, if you're not already involved, please get involved, learn more on the website, the Colorado Public Banking Coalition website. And again, that's coloradopublicbanking.org. And you can also, of course, visit the Public Banking Institute website to learn more there as well. So thank you everyone so much, and we'll hopefully have more of these in the weeks and months to come. So thank you, and everyone, hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, Micah.
Thanks, Micah. Very well.
Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you, Ellen.
Thanks.
Bye.